dough so your loaf of bread doesn't weigh 10 pounds. The opposite happens with wedging. The potter wants to get out all the air, because if the air bubbles stay in the clay, it will expand in the firing process and destroy the piece of pottery. I've had that happen several times. Getting rid of the air in our clay is much like getting rid of our ego. Releasing ego happens like wedging. It's working on our lives that's essential, just as we work with clay. Wedging aligns the particles, literally aligning the molecules so that there's harmony, making creation possible. So the creation of pieces of pottery on the wheel begins with the process of centering. The potter must work with clay to get it into the center of the wheel. This is the process of centering. My pottery teacher in Athens always said that if I was not centered, it would be hard to center the clay. I found that was truer than I wanted to believe. How often do we rush around in our lives, unclear about our deepest values, and so our lives become frenetic and disjointed. We become uncentered. Sometimes things don't hold together in our lives because we don't know what centers and grounds us. M.C. Richards wrote, "Centering is a verb. It's an ongoing process. I've said that centering as an archetype comes through the potter's wheel and the spinning clay takes shape. But archetypes are beings of special subtlety and paradox. So centering is not a model, but a way of balancing, a spiritual resource in times of conflict and imagination. It seems in certain lights to be an alchemical vessel, a retort, which bears an integration of purposes, an integration of levels of consciousness. It can be called to like a divine ear." So when we've centered the clay, there comes a moment when the clay just simply can't be centered. We have to be willing to be open, to be opened, so that we can move the clay and our lives into a deeper process of creation. Remaining closed to life or keeping the clay closed stops the unfolding process of creation. We would simply have a lump of clay otherwise, with no real form or use, maybe a doorstop. Of course, our risk in opening is that when we move into creation, the unexpected might happen. We have to risk what we envision for what the clay or life might have for us. So to work with clay on the wheel, one needs to use water. Water reminds us of all the things that come into our life: nourishment, learning, distraction. Water helps release the friction of working with clay. In life, we often experience things or possess things that help us shape who we are. To live with meaning, we need to learn what is sufficient, to know when to stop. Too much water can cause the clay to come apart, and we end up with a mess, a very muddy mess. Knowing the balance of water needed for creation takes practice. Without practice, we can't find the balance of water, movement, and clay. Life lesson. When we surround ourselves with too much or too many activities or things, or obsessive thoughts, we become like clay that has been too saturated with water. We can disintegrate. In a similar fashion, when working with clay, it's important to understand that to create something of beauty, we need to balance the inner and the outer. That's what Meredith has been doing. The inner life balanced with the outer life. When shaping clay, if there's too much pressure on the inner wall or the outer wall, we end up creating fragile places that can crack or have tears. Another life lesson: do the daily work it takes to learn how to create, how to maintain an inner and an outer balance. It will take focus, attention, and intention. One of the challenges when working with clay is to have too great an expectation of what a creation will look like. Likewise, to be too controlled about what we expect from life will keep us from experiencing new possibilities. A pot or our life might not turn out the way we expected. But then, of course, there will be wonderful surprises. A new piece of clay. Whether the last piece of clay turned out exactly as we planned, or if it fell apart, or turned out to be a surprise, we can begin again. We know that the practice and repetition of focusing on our lives, of centering our being, of finding our inner and outer balance are all essential to creating a pot and creating a life. Then, even though we know all of this, we get distracted, we forget, we get unfocused. What can then happen is that we spread ourselves too thin. We do so much that our lives become frenetic. And everything falls apart. It collapses. That was good timing, Meredith. The plans we had for our piece of art or our lives fall apart. And we need to begin again. A new day, a new piece of clay. We begin again, but life, like all forms of creation, is in part practice, nurturing the essential skills of life, focusing attention, clear intention, over and over, until eventually we create a life that is the one we wish to live. So it's exciting to finish a pot on the wheel. Yet when our pot is finally completed on the wheel, our work is not finished by a long shot. At this point, we may have a great vision of a wonderful creation, but in every step along the way, the unexpected can happen. We may have had a plan for a life that's very different than what we're living right now. But life has its own shape. So after the pieces of clay are thrown and taken off the wheel, it's going to need to dry to get rid of the excess moisture. But we also know that it's too fragile now. Sometimes we're too fragile. It's only by going through the fire that the clay becomes strong enough to be really useful. And sometimes after drying, we find that our piece of pottery needs more shaping. We may have excess clay. How many people have thrown pots and your first, 50 pots weighed, 75 pounds? Part of learning the process of working with clay is learning to get rid of all the excess that's not useful. Or it looks awfully plain, so we might want to decorate it. These choices for what we do with our pot can add beauty and texture. These aspects we can sort of control, but there's much that truly is out of our control. So one of the most important lessons with pots is to release attachment to outcome. When the fire burns out all the impurities, the clay is either strengthened or shattered. And then one has to adapt. I was showing the Phillips my beautiful, I was so proud. This is like the biggest bowl I've ever made. I spent a lot of time on it, and it got fired. So it's sort of like our opening words. It's not going to be a salad bowl. It's going to be a flower garden. So learning to adapt is very important. So Meredith is once again in the process of creation, returning to centering and creation to the archetype. M.C. Richards once again says, feel the whole in every part, the mystery and action and being of the whole living organism, of oneself and of that self which all of us together make, and of that earth where we are humanly born, and of that sun sphere that nourishes us too, and of all that universe that beats its way to us now through millions and trillions of light years. She writes again, as you go out, you come in. You always come into center. Bring the clay into center. You press down, squeeze up. Press one hand into the other, bringing your material into center. We bring ourself into a centering function, which brings it into union with all other elements. This is love. Then the miracle happens. When on center, the self feels different. One feels warm, in touch. The power of life, a substance, like an air in which one lives and has one's being with all other things. Drinking it in and giving it off at the same time, quiet and at rest within it. After our creations come out of the fire, then we have the step of decoration. And that's when another part of the play begins. Wow, Meredith, that's cool. when we're free to imagine what is impossible, what is possible for this piece of art, then our imagination can take shape and run wild. We have imagination in these pieces and another incredible kind of imagination to hand build. It's part of the artistic process, but it's also part of the artistic process of crafting a life. And sometimes our vision evolves and changes. The shape, the texture, the outcome from the burning might change how we want to deal with creation, with our life. Once again, after the decoration, our piece is put through the fire for the final time. And when it emerges, there can be disappointment and great excitement. There are always surprises, just like life. And I see that y'all are doing some interesting creations. Meredith, thank you for allowing us to think about clay as a metaphor. And at this time,